The silence that followed the death of Evelyn Reed's parents was the loudest thing she had ever known. It wasn't the kind of silence that suggests peace, but a heavy, velvet cloak that smothered sound and light, leaving her adrift in a world suddenly devoid of familiar contours. When Evelyn was 12, she was not prepared to process the loss of her mother to a sudden aneurysm, nor the subsequent, quieter tragedy of her father, a man who seemed to lose the will to navigate the world without his anchor. He had lasted 18 months before a reckless night drive into a blizzard claimed him too. It was this second, final tragedy that deposited her, at the age of 14, on the doorstep of her uncle and aunt in Ravenwood, Massachusetts, a town perpetually shrouded in a sea fog that seemed to drink the sun. Elias and Seraphina Thorne were artists, professors of performance and music, respectively, at the nearby college. Their house was not a house, Evelyn soon learned, but a shrine to sound. Every room held an instrument. A grand piano dominating the living room, a cello slumbering by the fireplace, and the ethereal, sharp tones of a cembalo often filtering down from Seraphina's third-floor study. "We are so glad to have you, Evelyn," Aunt Seraphina had declared on the first day, her voice a rich contralto that demanded attention. "You are the only other non-musician in the house, besides Elias, and we must stick together." But Evelyn was not a non-musician because she chose not to be. She was a non-musician because she lacked the spiritual connection to it. She had no desire to capture emotion in a scale or a chord. Her talent lay in the tangible, the structured, the hidden mechanics of creation. While her cousin, Harrison, a year younger and a virtuoso on the violin, would practice scales until the strings screamed, Evelyn retreated to the garage. She found solace in the smell of sawdust, the cold logic of blueprints, and the satisfying click of electrical wiring connecting to bring light where there was darkness. She could design a world, but she couldn't sing in one. It was her uncle Elias who had first recognized this specialized talent. He directed the college's theatrical productions, sprawling, ambitious affairs that required complex sets and lighting rigs. "You, my dear Evelyn, you understand the bones of the story," Elias had said one day, watching her calculate the precise angle needed for a spotlight. "Music is the heart, yes, but you build the body. You are the architect of the illusion." Evelyn, accustomed to indifference, found a quiet, profound validation in his words. She became Elias's shadow, spending her afternoons and weekends in the college workshops, learning the geometry of perspective, the physics of weight distribution, and the artistry of making a flimsy piece of plywood look like centuries-old stone. She found her center again, not on the stage, but behind it, hidden in the blackout, pulling the levers that brought the magic to life. The obsession with Ophelia. Elias Thorne was a man of grand passions, and in her senior year of high school, Evelyn witnessed the birth of his latest, most consuming obsession, the Ophelia Theater. The Ophelia was an architectural jewel in Ravenwood's crown, a Baroque opera house built in the late 19th century. But it was also a ghost. It had stood dark, locked, and condemned since 1998. Its elaborate stone facade perpetually weeping black moisture from the sea fog, like a grieving statue. One evening, Elias burst into the house, his coat still dripping with the damp night air, his face an alarming mask of fury. "They're going to tear it down, Seraphina. Tear it down," he raged, pacing the length of the living room, his shadow stretching and shrinking on the wall beside the grand piano. Seraphina, calmly marking a sheet of music, looked up with concern. "Tear what down, my love? The college cafeteria again?" "No, the Ophelia. They've finally approved the demolition order." said it's structurally unsound. A blight on the neighborhood. A goddamn blight. Elias threw his hands up in despair. The Ophelia Theater was a source of almost mythological pride for Ravenwood's artistic community, not just for its beauty, but for the dark, unspoken history that clung to its velvet curtains like dust. After a hushed, heated debate behind the study doors, which Evelyn and Harrison listened to with morbid curiosity, Harrison turned to Evelyn. "I know what this is about," he whispered, his eyes wide. "The Ophelia. Dad's been talking about that place since we moved here. It's his white whale. It's just an old, ugly building," Evelyn muttered, shivering slightly. She rode her bike past it every day, and even from the street the place felt wrong. Not merely abandoned, but malevolent. The few windows not boarded up were like blind, staring eyes. "It's not ugly, Ev," Harrison insisted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial level. "It's haunted, and Dad loves that too. He loves the mystique. You know the story, right? The freshman, Aria?" Evelyn shook her head, intrigued. "They say she was a prodigy, a true angel. She got the lead in the college's production that year, a creepy opera called Requiem for a Nightingale. The director, Victor Gremery, was apparently obsessed with her. Gave her the part, though everyone hated it because she was so timid. No family, no friends, just her voice." Harrison leaned closer, checking the study door once more. The night of the premiere, after her big solo, a piece about being trapped in a golden cage, she just ran off stage. Gremery followed. And then silence. They found a note, a sort of poetic resignation, but no body. And Gremery vanished without a trace. 2 other minor cast members too. The college shut it down the next morning. Said the Requiem was too dark. But everyone knows the place swallowed them. Evelyn felt a familiar chill, not the artistic kind that came from a beautifully rigged light, but a cold, ancestral dread. The story of the beautiful, lonely girl trapped by a controlling man and her own overwhelming talent resonated with the lonely girl in her. The lowest bid. The following week was consumed by Elias's frantic efforts to save the building. He spent hours on the phone, filing protests, and lobbying the college board. Evelyn and Harrison assumed he would fail. The Ophelia was a burden, a cursed relic. But Elias Thorne possessed a formidable will. He returned home one afternoon, not raging, but unervingly calm, holding a heavy, tarnished brass key in his hand. "They were tired of me," he announced, laying the key on the grand piano like a trophy. "So tired of the protests and the bureaucratic entanglement that they gave in. I bought it." Evelyn stared, dumbfounded. "You bought the condemned theater? For $800. Serafina sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Less than the deposit on a decent car. No one wanted the liability, the history, or the cleanup. They practically threw the deed at him. They can't wait to be rid of the Ophelia," Harrison whispered to Evelyn, barely concealing his excitement. "They want it gone so badly they practically paid Dad to take it." Elias beamed, his eyes bright with a manic energy. "It's ours. The Ophelia Theater is back. And this summer, before I reopen it to the community, we're going to scour the darkness out of it. Evelyn, Harrison, you two are going to be my crew. Paid, of course," he added, winking, knowing Evelyn would do it for the work alone, and Harrison would need the funds for new guitar pedals. Evelyn accepted instantly. Her practical side saw a massive engineering challenge. Restoring power, fixing rigging, rebuilding sets. Her darker, newly awakened curiosity saw an undeniable lure. A chance to step inside the shadow, to touch the forbidden history. The mute choir. The first day they arrived at the Ophelia, the early morning fog was thick, giving the theater a skeletal, blurred appearance. The silence was immediate and profound, a vacuum that sucked the sound out of the street. As Elias fumbled with the antique key, Evelyn felt the sensation again, that familiar wave of oppressive negative energy. But this time it was a physical blow. It was stronger, denser, pressing in on her skull and making her temples throb. The key turned with a metallic shriek that sounded inappropriately loud in the stillness. Elias pushed the heavy double doors inward. The air that greeted them was stagnant, cold, and tasted like pulverized dust and old copper. The lobby was not immediately horrifying. It was merely old. Tables with dusty lamps were scattered haphazardly, and faded posters from the last opera, Requiem for a Nightingale, were peeled at the edges. But as they moved deeper, the atmosphere changed. The main auditorium was vast and cavernous. The seats, covered in drop cloths that resembled ghostly figures, were intact. The stage, however, was frozen in time. A massive ornate birdcage prop stood center stage, tarnished and rusted, a chilling reminder of Aria's final performance. "It's perfectly preserved," Elias murmured, running a gloved hand along the railing of the orchestra pit. "They simply locked the door and walked away." "It's like a tomb," Harrison whispered, his usual bravado gone. Evelyn felt the suffocating energy intensifying. It wasn't just dust and decay. It was imprinted emotional residue. Everywhere she looked, she felt the weight of past suffering. She decided her focus would be backstage, the only place she felt truly at home. Backstage was a chaotic museum of forgotten dreams. Props for Requiem were everywhere. A tarnished brass instrument sat on a table. A half-painted backdrop of a gloomy Venetian alley leaned against the wall. And then, she saw it, the centerpiece of the tragedy. Tucked into a corner, covered by a sheet, was a tall, heavy prop, clearly meant to be a kind of altar or pedestal used in the opera's final act. It was crudely painted to look like dark, pitted stone. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She could suddenly visualize the scene. A fragile girl, a monstrous man, and this pedestal looming in the shadows. Shaking off the morbid image, she grabbed a broom and forced herself to begin sweeping up the accumulated filth. She was 10 minutes into the mindless, repetitive work when the sound hit. Crash, clang. It was a jarring, discordant slam of piano keys, or perhaps a cembalo, as if someone had thrown their entire weight onto the keyboard. The sound was muffled, distant, coming from the upper floors of the deserted theater. Evelyn froze, the broom handle slipping from her grasp. "Harrison?" she called out. The sound repeated. A brutal, aggressive thump-thump-thump of keys, followed by an unsettling, almost musical discord. Her heart hammering, she crept towards the stage, her flashlight beam cutting through the pervasive gloom. The noise stopped abruptly. She reached the stage, squinting out into the darkness of the auditorium. "Harrison, that wasn't funny," she snapped, forcing a tone of anger she didn't feel. "What wasn't funny?" A voice chirped from the rear of the theater. Harrison was jogging down the aisle, his cell phone flashlight bobbing, looking utterly confused. "I was checking the water line in the basement. Did you hear that sound?" Evelyn's eyes darted to the orchestra pit. There was a faint old cembalo down there, covered in dust. Nobody was near it. "The piano," Evelyn said, her voice shaking despite herself. "Someone was pounding the piano. Right here." Harrison laughed nervously. The orchestra pit is locked. And even if it wasn't, who would be in here? You're trying to scare me, Ev. That's such a cliché. Evelyn didn't argue. She forced a grin, agreeing she was just trying to pull a prank. But as she stood under the cold, dead stage lights, staring at the empty orchestra pit, a new, terrifying certainty settled in her. She was not alone. And the silence was not empty. It was merely a mute choir, waiting to sing again. Over the next few days, the strange incidents continued. The heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched never left her. While Elias and Harrison worked in the lobby and auditorium, Evelyn was delegated to the backstage area and the network of dark, twisting hallways. One afternoon, she was organizing ancient costume trunks near a small, unused wing off the Black Box Theater. To keep her mind off the cold air that always seemed to caress her neck, she began to hum a familiar, simple melody. A folk song she remembered her mother singing. She finished sweeping the area, pulled off her headphones, and stopped humming to admire her work. But the humming did not stop. It was faint, muffled, but distinctly the same melody, and coming from very close by. It was too low for Harrison, too gentle for Elias. It was a clear, ethereal sound, laced with a faint, sorrowful tremor. Evelyn slowly turned on her heavy-duty stage flashlight. The sound was leading her deeper into the shadows of the small wing. She followed the sorrowful hum until the beam fell on a narrow, forgotten wooden door tucked into the stone wall. It was almost perfectly camouflaged, a service door, perhaps. But what stopped her heart was the writing. Scrawled in what looked like faded, dry white paint were 3 words: the angel's entry. The humming was coming from behind that door. It was louder now, closer, almost a lullaby of pure despair. Evelyn raised a trembling hand towards the rusted brass knob. Just as her fingertips brushed the cold metal, the humming ceased. Abruptly, completely, she grasped the knob, twisted it, and immediately felt relief. It was locked. A heavy, industrial bolt had clearly been thrown decades ago. Probably a trapped animal, Ev, Harrison had said later, examining the door. He tried every key on Elias's massive ring. None worked. It's sealed. Don't worry. The college probably bricked up the inside after the whole mess. Evelyn wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe it was a raccoon or a stray cat. But the humming had been too pure, too musical, too sorrowful. It was a voice of utter despair. A voice that had been trapped for 20 years. A voice that belonged to Aria, the missing Nightingale. She knew then. She was standing at the entrance to the theater's core secret, and the secret was starting to sing just for her. Evelyn felt the familiar pull, the irresistible lure of the structure, the desire to unlock the mechanism, no matter how terrifying the result. The angel's entry had called out, and Evelyn Reed, the architect of illusion, was ready to open the final door. She just needed to figure out how. Evelyn found herself circling the angel's entry like a hawk circles prey. The wooden door, tucked awkwardly into a seam of the old stone wall, felt less like a forgotten utility closet and more like the beating heart of the theater's suppressed grief. The industrial bolt securing it was rusted solid, the metal almost fused to the frame by 2 decades of corrosive sea fog and disuse. It's a dead end, Ev, Elias had pronounced after a cursory inspection, running his hand over the faded white paint that spelled the ominous warning. Just an old dressing room that probably had a minor structural collapse in the 90s. Let's focus on the grid. The stage needs power before it needs ambience. Elias's practical focus was a shield against the theater's malevolence. But for Evelyn, the ambience was the problem. She couldn't shake the sorrowful lullaby that had lured her to the door. Now, the humming didn't wait for her to be alone. It simply threaded itself through the din of Elias's shouting and Harrison's careless hammering. It was always the same melody. A simple, four-note phrase that ascended and then fell away, dissolving into despair. Evelyn found herself unable to focus on calculating the stress loads of the fly system. Her eyes kept drifting to the door, to the 3 words that had been scrawled there. The first clear vision arrived a week into the cleanup. Evelyn was in the main dressing room wing, a long corridor lined with dusty vanities and mirrored stations. This was where the phantom cembalo sounds often seemed to originate. She was scraping off old, peeling wallpaper, a tedious task that allowed her mind to wander. She had paused at a station that seemed untouched by time. The large mirror, framed in tarnished silver, was coated in a fine layer of dust, reflecting nothing but the vague outline of the light fixture above. As she looked down to pick up her scraper, the air suddenly dropped 10 degrees. The silence returned, that oppressive, smothering vacuum, drowning out the distant sounds of work. Evelyn's breath hitched, turning visible in the sudden cold. When she looked up again, the mirror was no longer dusty. It was perfectly clean, reflecting her own terrified face, illuminated by the harsh, single bulb. But she wasn't alone in the reflection. Standing directly behind her, where the empty hallway should have been, was a girl. Aria. The girl in the mirror looked no older than 17, pale and fragile, dressed in a tattered, cream-colored slip. Her eyes were impossibly large, swimming in fear, and her expression was one of absolute, mute agony. The most horrifying detail was her neck. A jagged, dark line, like a seam crudely stitched with shadow, ran horizontally across her throat. Evelyn couldn't move. Her heart jackhammered against her ribs. She tried to scream, but the air felt too thick, too heavy to push through her lungs. Then the reflection shifted. Aria didn't move her body, but her head tilted slowly, impossibly, at a 45-degree angle. Her silent mouth opened, and in the reflection, Evelyn saw not a voice, but a fleeting spray of feathers, small, dark, and utterly silent, billow out from the girl's cut throat. The illusion shattered. The sound of Elias dropping a metal wrench downstairs ripped the oppressive silence. The mirror instantly returned to its dusty, non-reflective state, the image of Aria vanishing like water into sand. Evelyn leaned against the wall, hyperventilating. It was a vision, a hallucination induced by stress and the theater's decaying atmosphere. But the cold air lingered, and the scent of old copper and decay was sharp in her nostrils. She knew she hadn't just seen a ghost. She had seen a memory, played out for her benefit. The encounter solidified Evelyn's mission. She had to know what Aria suffered and why the ghost was choosing her as an audience. Elias's construction blueprints wouldn't help her now. She needed archives and history. That night, Evelyn told Elias and Serafina she had a major design paper due and needed access to the college library's special collections. They were too preoccupied with their own artistic struggles. Elias fighting zoning boards, Serafina grappling with a particularly difficult Bach fugue, to notice the desperation in her eyes. Evelyn found the college library's special collections room locked tight. But Evelyn was the architect of illusion. She knew about service tunnels, emergency exits, and poorly secured air ducts. Using a borrowed set of master keys, which Elias conveniently left lying around, and her own custom-made wire tools, she gained access to the archive room at midnight. The air was sterile, smelling of formaldehyde and aging paper. She found the index for the Ophelia Theater and the 1998 incident immediately. The file was thin, labeled Thorne/Gremery Incident, Aria Disappearance. The newspaper clippings told the official story. A tragic case of a gifted, sensitive student named Aria, no last name ever given, just Aria, who buckled under the pressure of the lead role, ran away, and likely committed suicide. Director Victor Gremery, though initially questioned due to his volatile artistic temperament, was also listed as a missing person. The general consensus was a murder-suicide or a pact, though no bodies were ever found. Evelyn skimmed the cold, official words, searching for the heart of the horror. She found it tucked at the bottom of the box. A sheaf of papers, torn, stained, and barely legible, labeled Evidence. Students' personal effects. It was Aria's journal. Evelyn spread the fragments across the reading table, piecing together the timeline of a girl's descent. October 4th, 1998. He says my voice is too pure for this world. He says the other singers are muddy, common. Gremery says I am a spirit trapped in a common cage, and he, my director, is the only one who knows the key. I don't like the way he looks at me, like I'm not a person, but an object, a flawless instrument to be played only by him. October 20th, 1998. The others hate me. They call me the feathered thing. They laugh when I miss a cue. Gremery doesn't stop them. He encourages it. He says the suffering makes the note sharper, the pitch higher. He locked me in the small dressing room today, the one no one uses, and made me practice the golden cage aria until my throat bled. He kept whispering, "Sing for me, angel. Only for me." November 1st, 1998. The premiere is tomorrow. The final scene. The nightingale breaks its cage. I hate the song. I hate the cage. Gremery changed the final lines. They used to be about finding freedom. Now they are about finding escape. He says escape is only possible when the instrument is silenced forever, when the voice returns to the ether, pure and untouched by human hands. The final entry was just a single horrifying paragraph, written in a frantic, shaky hand, the ink blurring into a dark smear. November 3rd, 1998. After the performance. He followed me. He saw the note. He knows I can't leave. The cage is not made of gold or steel. It is made of my own voice. I ran back to the room. He says I belong to him. He says he will keep me here forever, singing in the darkness. He is coming for me. But I have a key now, a piece of the vanity mirror I broke. If the voice is the cage, then the key must be silence. I must cut the string. I must find my way out. I must find my angel's entry. The last phrase chilled Evelyn to the bone. I must find my angel's entry. It confirmed her worst fear. The words scrawled on the door were Aria's last, desperate testament. The room was not a closet. It was a sanctuary, a cell, and a tomb. Ariel's story was tragically clear. Gremery had cornered her in that secluded room, perhaps intending to keep her hostage or worse. But Aria, in a final, horrifying act of reclaiming control over her voice and her fate, had performed a gruesome self-mutilation to achieve absolute, permanent silence before he could claim her fully. The investigation fueled Evelyn's obsession, but it also made her reckless. She began spending nearly 20 hours a day at the Ophelia. Elias, wrapped up in permitting issues, barely noticed. Harrison was focused on setting up a temporary sound system in the auditorium. Evelyn, meanwhile, focused on the physical impossibility of the locked door. The bolt was thick, ancient, and positioned awkwardly. She couldn't use a crowbar without alerting Elias. She needed a way to neutralize the metal without noise. It was during this time that Elias introduced the final member of their cleanup crew, Silas. Silas was an older man, a career electrician from the nearby docks, with hands scarred by a lifetime of working with live wires and unforgiving metal. He was quiet, pragmatic, and possessed an unsettling ability to observe without judging. "Silas is going to run the new wiring for us, Evelyn," Elias chirped, oblivious to the fact that Silas's cynical, dark eyes seemed to take in the theater's entire history in one sweeping glance. Silas gave Evelyn a curt nod. "You the stage tech? Good. You keep the lights running. I keep the building from burning down." Evelyn found herself respecting Silas's brutal pragmatism. He moved through the theater with a total disregard for its history, whistling a popular rock song while he pulled dusty, ancient cables out of the walls. He was a grounding force in the supernatural chaos. However, Silas also noticed the things Elias didn't. One afternoon, Silas found Evelyn standing motionless by the angel's entry door, her palm resting flat against the wood. "Cold spot," Silas stated flatly, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. He wasn't asking, he was observing. Evelyn flinched, pulling her hand away. "Just checking the wood integrity." "Dry rot." Silas raised a skeptical eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "Nah. Dry rot doesn't make the air drop 40 degrees. And it doesn't hum. You hear that humming, stage tech?" Evelyn's breath caught. He heard it too. "It's the wind through the ventilation," she lied weakly. "No, it's not," Silas corrected, his voice losing its cynical edge and becoming something else, something almost fearful. "The cembalo sound, yeah, that's acoustic trickery. But the humming, that's pure. Too pure. It's like a song that forgot how to sing." He moved closer to the door, his large, calloused hand hovering near the scrawled inscription. "This place is old. The seen things. Don't go digging for bodies, kid. Some secrets are best left sealed." But the warning was too late. Evelyn was already consumed. Silas's words only confirmed that she wasn't mad. The phenomenon was real. The architect's scheme. Evelyn realized a crowbar would be too loud, and drilling would be too slow. She needed a way to bypass the bolt cleanly. She found her answer in the old wiring closet. Using her knowledge of chemistry, gleaned from her high school textbooks and a forgotten theater prop manual, she began mixing a highly corrosive, non-acidic solvent, a powerful degreaser mixed with an industrial-grade rust neutralizer, and a hint of mercury powder she found in an old thermometer. The mixture was designed to eat away at the specific composition of the brass bolt without leaving significant noise or residue. She worked only when Elias and Harrison were gone, usually late at night, under the single, harsh glow of her work lamp. The haunting was intensifying. Now, when she walked through the theater, she didn't just hear the humming. She saw shadows darting at the periphery of her vision. They weren't clearly formed ghosts, but rapid, black smears that looked like feathers tearing through the air. And the cembalo, it had become more aggressive. One night, while she was applying the solvent to the door's bolt using a makeshift syringe, a brutal, discordant sound ripped through the silence of the auditorium. It wasn't the sound of someone sitting on the keys. It was a manic, frantic, almost violent rendition of Aria's sorrowful four-note melody. The cembalo music was fast, desperate, and filled with a terrifying, raw grief. It sounded like someone was trying to force the instrument to sing a song it refused to play. The cacophony lasted for a full 30 seconds, ending only when Evelyn recoiled from the door, clutching her head. When she looked back at the door, She noticed the white paint of the angel's entry seemed darker, damper, almost glistening under her light, as if something dark had bled into the writing. It was a sign. Aria was becoming impatient. Or maybe she was frightened that Evelyn would fail. Evelyn knew she was running out of time. The solvent needed only one more application. The following morning, Evelyn arrived before dawn. The mist was particularly thick, clinging to the theater's Baroque facade like a shroud. She walked past the empty stage, the massive birdcage prop standing sentinel in the gloom. The oppressive silence was back, thicker than ever before. But this time, it was laced with the faint, intoxicating smell of night-blooming jasmine. A scent so beautiful and out of place it felt profoundly wrong. She reached the angel's entry. The bolt, after the final application of her solvent, was dark, pitted, and barely clinging to the wood. Evelyn had brought a small, specialized metal wire, a piece of piano wire she had found in the orchestra pit, designed for high-tension cutting. She knelt down, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against the cold stone floor, and carefully inserted the wire behind the bolt. She pulled it taut, ready to sever the last strands of rusted metal. And then, she heard the voice. It wasn't the hum. It wasn't the cembalo. It was a faint, almost inaudible whisper, seemingly right beside her ear, yet cold as the grave. Don't cut it. Just push. The voice was clear, soft, and utterly persuasive. Evelyn hesitated, her hands frozen on the wire. She looked back over her shoulder into the darkness of the hall, but there was nothing. It's already free. The lock is only for the mind, little architect. Just push. Taking a deep, ragged breath, Evelyn abandoned the wire. Her hands trembling, she wrapped her fingers around the pitted brass knob. She didn't turn it. She simply pressed forward, putting her entire weight against the rusted wood. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a sound not of breaking metal, but of tearing flesh, the door gave way. The industrial bolt snapped clean, falling to the stone floor with a dull, hollow thud. The smell of jasmine exploded, thick and suffocating, and the sound of silence was ripped apart by a sudden, piercing crescendo. The sound of a single, agonizing, beautiful high C note, sung with perfect clarity, and then abruptly cut short. The angel's entry was open, and inside, a deeper, older darkness waited. Evelyn stood on the threshold, staring into a blackness that seemed to absorb her light, knowing that she had finally crossed the line from investigator to participant. The moment Evelyn stepped across the threshold of the angel's entry, the physical world dissolved. It wasn't a gentle transition. It was like diving headfirst into freezing water, the shock assaulting every sensory nerve. The smell of jasmine, which had been intoxicating, turned rank and sickly sweet, like flowers decaying on a corpse. The cold air didn't just linger. It pressed, thick and heavy, pinning her clothes to her skin. The darkness inside the room was absolute, a true light-devouring void that swallowed the beam of her powerful stage lamp whole. Evelyn fumbled, dropping the lamp. It hit the floor with a metallic thud that should have resonated in the stone room, but the sound was immediately choked off. She was trapped in the deepest silence yet, the ultimate, final quiet of the theater. "Aria?" she whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud, thin, and brittle in the void. No answer. Only the overwhelming sensation of being watched by multiple unseen eyes. She could feel the faint, desperate rhythm of the four-note melody. Not heard, but felt vibrating deep within the tissue of her neck. She crawled forward, her hands sweeping across the floor, searching for her lamp. Her fingers brushed against something brittle and dry, like old parchment. When she lifted the object to the faint light filtering under the jammed door, she saw it was a single shriveled black feather. Then the floor became solid beneath her. The oppressive blackness dissolved, replaced by a sudden, jarring burst of sickly yellow light, emanating from a single, dusty bulb hanging precariously from a wire. Evelyn was standing not in a storage room, but in a tiny, claustrophobic dressing room. It was furnished with a cracked vanity table, a single wooden chair, and walls covered in cheap, floral wallpaper that was stained and tearing. It was Aria's sanctuary, her cell. Evelyn turned, desperately searching for the door she had just opened. It was there, but the inscription was gone. The wood was clean, painted a smooth, faded blue, and the industrial bolt was perfectly in place, shining, new, and secure. She was completely sealed in. The memory playback. The air around her began to thrum, not with sound, but with residual panic. Evelyn felt a sudden, dizzying sense of disorientation. She was Evelyn, the pragmatist, the architect. But her hands, she noticed, were suddenly smaller, paler, and trembling uncontrollably. A faint, mocking whisper echoed from the ceiling. "Look at the angel. So fragile." Another voice, harsher, chimed in. "The feathered thing can't even hold a note when the director isn't watching." Evelyn spun around, her heart pounding with a sudden, overwhelming sense of shame that wasn't hers. She wasn't just observing Aria's trauma. She was experiencing it. She was standing in the epicenter of the psychological abuse, caught in a playback loop of terror. The harsh voice belonged to a man who suddenly materialized in the cracked mirror. Victor Gremery. He wasn't a ghost of the victim, but a chilling, hyper-real projection of the abuser, standing directly behind her. He was tall, dressed in the severe black suit he wore during rehearsals, his hair slicked back, his eyes burning with possessive mania. "Aria," Gremery's projection whispered, his voice resonating with a terrifying intimacy that made Evelyn physically recoil. "You disappoint me. After the performance tonight, the grand escape, you run? You attempt to defy the only person who recognizes your sacred destiny." Evelyn tried to scream his name, Gremery, but the scream caught in her throat. When she opened her mouth, the sound that emerged was a small, high-pitched whimper. It was Aria's voice. Evelyn was no longer Evelyn. She was Aria, trapped in the final, agonizing minutes of her life. Gremery's hand, large and skeletal, reached out in the mirror and landed heavily on Evelyn's, Aria's shoulder. The touch was agonizingly cold, like lead pressing through her clothes. "You wrote a note," he hissed, his face inches from her reflected image. "You thought you could leave the cage? The gold is not on the bars, Aria. The gold is in your throat, and I own the sound. I own the instrument." He began to stroke her neck, tracing the delicate curve of her larynx. The touch was unbearable, a violation that made Evelyn's entire body lock up in revulsion. "Listen to them," Gremery murmured, tilting her chin up. "Listen to the common filth." A low, grating chorus of laughter suddenly filled the small room, accompanied by the muffled thump-thump-thump of a manic cembalo in the distance. The laughter seemed to come from the wallpaper itself, mocking, dismissive, the phantom sound of the jealous cast members. "The feathered thing. Sing for your master. Go back to your cage, Aria. You're nothing without Gremery." The psychological assault was overwhelming. Evelyn, as Aria, felt the walls closing in, the mockery piercing her like needles. The truth of the journal entry was now a terrifying, lived reality. Her voice was the prison, and Gremory was the jailer. The act of silence. Evelyn's mind, still fighting against Aria's memory, searched desperately for an exit. She remembered the key, the piece of the vanity mirror I broke. Her eyes, desperate and wide in the reflection, scanned the floor near the vanity. There, half hidden beneath the flimsy wooden chair, was a large, jagged shard of glass, the remnant of the broken mirror. It gleamed wickedly in the sickly light, reflecting only blackness. Gremory's hand was now squeezing Aria's neck, not hard enough to choke, but hard enough to signify total control. You will never find escape, little bird. You will sing for me, in the dark, for eternity. A wave of pure, absolute desperation, Aria's final resolve, flooded Evelyn's consciousness. It was a fierce, cold resolve, more potent than any fear. If the voice was the cage, then destruction of the voice was the only possible freedom. Evelyn's, Aria's, hand shot out, snatching the shard of glass from the floor. The cold, sharp edge bit into her palm immediately, but the pain was distant, secondary to the crushing horror on her neck. Gremory saw the movement in the mirror. His phantom eyes widened in genuine, momentary shock. "No! My instrument!" he bellowed, his voice losing its seductive calm and becoming the raw scream of a frustrated tyrant. Evelyn didn't hesitate. Driven by the fierce, final conviction of a life utterly extinguished by abuse, she brought the glass shard to her throat. There was no sound of a scream, no operatic cry of pain. There was only a sickening, wet tearing sound, immediately followed by the terrifying, wheezing rush of air escaping through an unintended, ragged opening. Blood erupted warm, thick, and metallic, splashing across the cracked vanity, the floral wallpaper, and coating her small, pale hands. The pain was instant, blinding, an electric current of fire running down her spine. Evelyn felt a terrible, profound release. The touch on her neck vanished. Gremory's phantom image dissolved in the mirror, his face frozen in a silent, impotent fury. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching the wound, the world spinning violently. She fell against the wall, dragging her bloodied hand downward. In her vision, she saw the white paint of Aria's initial inscription, the angel's entry, now being overwritten by a new, gruesome message, scrawled in her own, newly spilled blood. "My way out." The petrified chorus. The memory ended as abruptly as it began. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, panting, the ghost pain in her throat searing her consciousness. She was Evelyn again, her clothes dry, her hands clean, her throat intact. But the metallic smell of copper blood and the heavy scent of jasmine clung to her like a second skin. She opened her eyes and saw the reality of the room, now illuminated by a thin ray of light from a crack in the ceiling. The small, dusty room was still there, but the illusion of the benign dressing room was gone, replaced by a tomb. The wallpaper was peeling back, not from age, but revealing the rough, ancient stone underneath. And fused into that rough stone, as if they had tried to burrow into the very foundations of the theater to escape, were three figures. They were horrifyingly preserved, the result of some terrible, petrifying force. The stone had flowed around them like liquid concrete, trapping them in the moment of their final, horrific realization. The central figure was Victor Gremory. He was trapped headfirst, his powerful shoulders wedged into the stone up to his neck. His mouth was stretched open in a wide, silent scream, and his eyes, the cruel, possessive eyes Evelyn had just seen, were not merely closed or empty. They had been violently removed, leaving two dark, vacant sockets. Flanking him were the two missing cast members, solidified into the wall up to their waists. Their faces were pale, their expressions twisted in expressions of absolute terror and eternal regret. Their mouths, too, were distorted, but unlike Gremory's open scream, their lips had been pulled taut and sewn shut by some invisible force, signifying their forced silence and complicity. Feathers, small, black, brittle bird feathers, were embedded in the stone around their heads, clinging to their petrified hair like macabre funeral confetti. This was Aria's revenge. This was the true requiem for a nightingale, the angel's chord. A soft, cold breeze drifted from the corner of the room, carrying the overwhelming, sickly sweet jasmine scent. Evelyn struggled to her knees, looking toward the dark corner. A figure was coalescing in the gloom. It was Aria, but no longer the fragile girl in the mirror. This was the Aria who had taken her destiny into her own hands, the spirit of vengeful, silent rage. She wore the same tattered cream-colored slip, but it was soaked through with a dark, glistening stain. Her hair, long and dark, fell forward, obscuring her face, but not the terrifying wound on her neck. It was a deep, ragged gash, and from it, a dark liquid, not blood but shadow, dripped silently onto the floor. Aria raised a trembling hand. In her palm, she held a small, desiccated object, the vocal cord. It was black, twisted, and looked like a piece of charcoal-colored sinew, glistening faintly with oil. Evelyn tried to scramble backwards, but her legs were useless. The ghost of Aria stepped closer, the motion of her feet utterly soundless. Aria's mouth opened. No sound came out. Instead, a sudden, powerful gust of air erupted from her gaping neck wound. The gust carried thousands of razor-sharp black feathers, which flew at Evelyn like a swarm of angry insects. Evelyn screamed a real, raw scream, throwing her arms up to shield her face. The feathers were not merely an illusion. They were physical, stinging and slicing into her exposed skin. She felt 1,000 tiny cuts on her arms and cheeks. The gust subsided. Aria stood before her, tilting her wounded head. And then, Evelyn heard her, not with her ears, but directly inside her mind. A cold, clear, resonant whisper that cut through her terror. The nightingale has sung its final requiem. I have silenced the instrument, little architect. Look upon my work. This is my way out. Aria's focus was terrible, absolute. She wasn't merely showing Evelyn. She was transferring the pain, the burden, the final, desperate desire for escape. The moment Aria's silent, telepathic declaration ended, Evelyn felt a terrible, crushing weight descend upon her neck, the phantom echo of the wire cutting the fragile tissue. She fell forward, coughing violently, her lungs desperate for air. The intervention. Elias Thorne had noticed the unusual quiet. Harrison, focused on running a low-voltage test, hadn't. But Silas had. Your niece went quiet, Silas said. His eyes narrowed, staring into the dark hallway where Evelyn had vanished. Too quiet for a stage tech running wire. Sounds like the theater finally swallowed her. Elias, alarmed by Silas's bluntness, rushed down the hall. He found the angel's entry door, which he swore was painted blue, now covered in a fresh coat of stark white. The 3 words, the angel's entry, stark against the wood. But the heavy, industrial bolt was back in place, freshly shining, as if it had been sealed only moments ago. "Evelyn," Elias hammered on the thick wood. "Open the door. This isn't funny." All he heard was the low, desperate wheezing of air on the other side. "She's not breathing right," Silas rumbled, already moving to the fuse box. "Stand back, Professor. This isn't a play. It's a crisis." Silas grabbed a heavy fire axe he kept for emergency ventilation. He took one look at the shimmering, impossibly clean bolt, spat on the ground, and swung the axe not at the lock, but at the door itself, just beside the frame. The wood fractured with a tremendous, splintering sound, ripping apart the oppressive silence of the theater. Elias shoved the broken door inward. The sickly sweet smell of jasmine and old blood hit them both like a wall. They found Evelyn collapsed on the floor, clawing desperately at her own throat, leaving angry red welts on her skin. Her eyes were wide, vacant, staring past them at a point on the wall that only she could see. "She's in shock," Elias cried, rushing forward. Silas, however, stopped at the threshold. His eyes, usually cynical, were now filled with a deep, ancestral dread. He saw the faint, dark stains smeared on the wall where Evelyn had leaned. He saw the tiny, black feathers scattered on the floor, and he saw the terrifying, open-mouthed horror on Evelyn's face. Silas grabbed her from Elias, hauling her out of the room like a heavy sack, dragging her across the stone floor and out into the relative safety of the hallway light. As the two men struggled with Evelyn's limp, shuddering body, the small, violent room seemed to exhale. The door, broken and hanging precariously, swung slowly shut, sealing Aria and her petrified prisoners once more into the heart of the Ophelia. Evelyn was safe, but the spirit of the angel was not finished. It had found its new audience, and its final song was about to begin. Evelyn's return from the angel's entry was not a return to health, but a retreat into a state of hyper-aware catatonia. The hospital stay was brief. Doctors found no physical injury beyond the superficial cuts from the razor-sharp feathers, dismissing her severe respiratory distress and panic attacks as a reaction to acute stress and chemical fumes, a diagnosis Elias readily accepted. But Evelyn knew the truth. She had lived a death. She had felt the icy violation of Victor Gremery's touch and the clean, fierce release of Aria's self-destruction. The phantom pressure on her throat remained, a constant, dull ache that prevented her from speaking in anything louder than a soft, rasping whisper. The architect had been silenced. She retreated to the relative quiet of the Thorne house, but the quiet was a lie. The Ophelia had followed her home. She kept the relic hidden. The vocal cord, a piece of blackened, twisted sinew, now dried and hard as stone. She wrapped it in silk and placed it inside a small, sealed lead box she had once used for electrical components. She found that the box, a container designed to block electromagnetic interference, seemed to partially dampen the psychic resonance radiating from the object. But the cord's power wasn't gone. It was merely muted. Aria's presence had latched onto Evelyn, but her focus was still the theater, and more alarmingly, the musicians within it. Elias, oblivious to the true nature of the trauma, chalked up Evelyn's silence and pallor to the emotional shock of the old theater's atmosphere. He threw himself into his work with renewed, almost desperate energy. He was determined to stage a showcase production in the Ophelia to prove it was safe and viable. He chose an upbeat, early 20th century musical, the polar opposite of Requiem for a Nightingale. Harrison, however, was the primary target. The attack on the musician. Harrison was practicing daily for a violin audition, rehearsing a complex, emotionally demanding concerto in the living room. Since Evelyn's incident, the grand piano, Serafina's instrument, had remained closed. But the house itself was turning against the music. Evelyn was sitting in the corner, watching Harrison's bow glide over the strings, when the temperature plunged. Harrison, lost in the music, didn't notice, but Evelyn saw the condensation forming instantly on the windows, followed by the familiar, cloying scent of night-blooming jasmine. The music changed. Harrison was playing a soaring, triumphant passage, but suddenly, a discordant, screeching counterpoint joined him. The phantom cembalo. It wasn't muffled anymore. It was aggressive, sharp, right there in the room, tearing apart the melody. Harrison grimaced, stopping his performance abruptly. He pulled the bow away, shaking his head. "What the hell was that? Did you hear that, Ev?" It was like someone threw an entire orchestra into a shredder. Evelyn could only shake her head, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't whisper a warning. The phantom pressure on her throat was too great. "It sounded like 100 broken strings," Harrison muttered, rubbing his ear. "But I don't see where it came from." Evelyn watched in horror as a thin, black smear, a streak of pure shadow, danced briefly in the air above the empty grand piano. It was Aria, focusing her terrible, soundless rage on the living instruments of the house. The attacks grew bolder. During Harrison's final run-through before his audition, the lights in the living room suddenly exploded, showering glass everywhere. The shadow smear descended directly onto his violin, leaving a patch of cold, dark moisture on the polished wood. Harrison fled the room, convinced he was going insane. Evelyn knew she had to take action. Aria wasn't trying to kill them outright. She was trying to silence them. She saw music as the source of her original pain and imprisonment, and now she sought to shatter every instrument and voice around her new audience. The architect's final plan. Evelyn realized that while Aria was a spirit of sound, Evelyn herself was a master of space and structure. Aria had sought escape by destroying her voice. Evelyn would seek control by manipulating the physical cage that held the spirit. She returned to the Ophelia Theater, taking the sealed lead box with her. The theater was empty now, Elias having temporarily suspended work to deal with the chaos at home. Silas had packed up his tools and left, sensing the job was beyond his pragmatic capabilities. Evelyn walked through the deserted backstage area, the silence heavier than ever, now infused with expectation. She reached the angel's entry. The door was still broken, the axe marks ugly and raw, and the massive bolt, freshly clean, was still inexplicably secured, somehow repairing itself with residual, dark energy. Aria's humming began immediately, a low, intense vibration that felt like electricity running over broken glass. Evelyn looked at the black relic in the lead box, the vocal cord. This object was not merely a memory. It was the key to Aria's eternal torment and, ironically, the source of her localized power. Aria is trapped by her own silence, but the relic ties her to this structure, Evelyn thought, her mind clicking back into the precise, logical mode of the architect. If the relic is the anchor, I must seal the anchor in a tomb that cannot be opened or even accessed by sound. Evelyn had studied the theater's blueprints obsessively. She knew the angel's entry was located in a supporting section of the foundational stone, a massive block that hadn't been touched since 1880. Her plan was simple, brutal, and utterly final. The eternal seal. Evelyn started with what she could build. She used the heavy, industrial soundproofing foam left over from an old stage project, meticulously lining the exposed interior of the broken angel's entry door. She then built a rudimentary frame, reinforcing the door with thick sheets of steel salvaged from a condemned fly rig. As she worked, Aria's presence became a palpable cold fury. Black feathers materialized in the air, swirling around Evelyn's head, cutting her exposed skin. The sound of the cembalo started. Not the frantic melody, but a series of slow, mournful, heavy chords that seemed to shake the very foundations of the theater. Each chord ending with a sickening thud, like a body hitting the floor. Evelyn ignored the physical pain, the terror. Her focus was absolute. The blueprint, the measurements, the seal. The moment came for the final act. Evelyn took the lead box containing the vocal cord and, using industrial-strength construction adhesive, sealed it deep inside the small cavity next to the door's shattered frame, the original foundation stone. She wasn't just hiding it. She was making it an inseparable part of the building's permanent structure. Then, she moved to the core of her plan. Silence through mass. She found the industrial grout mix Elias had left for floor repairs, a heavy, dense, quick-drying concrete compound. She mixed it with the strongest polymer resin she could find in the prop workshop, creating an almost indestructible sound-dampening cement. Aria's mental voice assaulted her, now a screech of pure, silent panic. "Architect, you dare? You attempt to cage the free spirit? I will sing you into the stone." Evelyn, still unable to speak, forced herself to meet the darkness, her own architect's will overriding the fear. She whispered in her mind, "I am not caging you, Aria. I am giving you the final, eternal silence you sought." She took the mixed compound and began to pour it into the broken angel's entry door cavity. The effect was instantaneous and violent. As the thick, gray cement enveloped the relic and the remaining darkness within the room, the Ophelia Theater responded with a primal scream. The central birdcage prop on the stage, Aria's gilded prison, suddenly buckled and collapsed with a deafening metallic shriek. All the theater's lights, recently restored by Silas, burst in unison. The cembalo in the orchestra pit exploded upward, its ancient wood splintering into a million pieces. Evelyn was thrown back by the physical force of the explosion. The air was filled with flying debris and dust, and the stench of burning jasmine. But one sound was missing, the haunting, sorrowful humming. It was gone. Evelyn stood up, bruised, deafened by the rupture, but intact. She looked at the sealed door. The cement had hardened almost instantly, leaving a thick, unmoving gray slab of pure, absolute silence. She took a permanent marker from her pocket and scrawled her final inscription across the concrete seal. Requiem, eternal. Epilogue, the architect's legacy. The events of that night were recorded in the Ravenwood papers as a catastrophic electrical fire and structural collapse at the Ophelia Theater. Elias Thorne, heartbroken and defeated, finally agreed to sell the property back to the college for demolition, accepting that the building was simply too far gone to save. Harrison and Evelyn left Ravenwood and the Thorne house soon after. Harrison enrolled in a music conservatory miles away, his violin skills untouched, but his love for performance permanently shaded by a subtle, underlying dread. He never spoke of the Ophelia, nor the phantom sound that had invaded his music. Evelyn went to college to study architectural history and structural engineering. She became a specialist in restoring historical structures, buildings that possessed bones and secrets. She was highly successful, known for her unnerving attention to detail and her ability to instinctively identify weaknesses and hidden spaces in century-old masonry. She never spoke of Aria, Gremory, the petrified chorus, or the vocal cord sealed deep within the foundation of the Ophelia. However, the theater had changed her. She retained the persistent, quiet whisper in her throat. She found she could no longer tolerate loud noises, and often wore sound-dampening headphones, preferring the cushioned isolation. But she also possessed something new. Evelyn, the pragmatic architect who had no spiritual connection to art, could now hear music in a way no one else could. Whenever she listened to a piece, whether a concerto or a simple folk tune, she heard not just the notes, but the underlying emotion, raw, painful, sometimes joyous, vibrating within the very air, a constant low resonance in her mind. Aria's final gift, or perhaps her final curse, was the ability to feel sound with the intensity of pain. Years later, while working on the restoration of a decaying Baroque church, Evelyn was examining the ancient organ pipes. She noticed a faint, pervasive scent of jasmine. She paused, running her scarred fingertips over the cold, hollow metal. She closed her eyes, and deep in the structure of her neck, she felt the familiar, faint vibration of a four-note sequence. Ascend, ascend, fall away. The angel was silent, locked away in her eternal tomb. But the angel's cord, a sliver of darkness, now ran through Evelyn's own soul. The architect of illusion had sealed the cage, but in doing so, she had become the new, eternally aware audience for the song that forgot how to sing. The Ophelia Theater was gone, but Aria's Requiem had only just begun.